Hello. I've been in Rome recently, and I found some interesting things out about the Colosseum. We were at the Colosseum, and I've been questioning for some time the existence of and the prevalence of Christian martyrdom in the first century, one of the second centuries, and the first few centuries of the faith. And it turns out that isn't actually that much evidence for widespread Christian martyrdom. There are a couple of instances in the first 3 centuries that talk about a Diocletian um, period of Christian martyrdom, and also before that, Domitian. Now he's an interesting fella, the brother of Titus, who's intricately linked with the very first um, stories of and a lot of the symbolism within the Christian faith. Creating Christ, great documentary. You'll find it online. It came out only about a week ago. Very interesting, showing the connections between the Flavian family and the the Christian church, Christian origins. The vast numbers of peoples associated with Christianity were actually members of the family, the Flavian family, and not vast numbers, but quite a few very important early adopters of the faith. And also, I found out that 80%, something like 57 out of the 83 or so, I might have those numbers slightly wrong, popes from that period onwards had Flavius in their name. So obviously, there's something there. Let's have a look though at at martyrdom in Rome in the first century, and it's specifically to do with the Colosseum here. I asked the question to ChatGPT: were there any Christian martyrs killed in the Roman Colosseum? And ChatGPT: yes, there are many Christians martyrs who were executed in Rome, in the Roman Colosseum during the early centuries of Christianity. They faced persecution and were often subjected to public spectacles and brutal executions for their beliefs. Are you sure of that? Says Christian. Yes, historical records and accounts from that time period document the persecution of Christians in ancient Rome, and the Colosseum was indeed one of the places where some Christians faced martyrdom. Their stories have been recorded in various historical texts and documents. Source some. Certainly, several historical sources mention the persecution of Christians in ancient Rome, including their martyrdom in places like the Colosseum. Pay attention. Emphasis added. Here are a few notable sources: Tacitus Annuals, Pliny the Younger's letters, the Acts of the Martyrs, Eusebius' church history. Eusebius comes along in the 4th century. So these sources, among others, provide historical evidence of the persecution of Christians in ancient Rome. Not the Colosseum, interesting. And the occurrence of martyrdom, some of which took place in venues like the Colosseum. Okay, any during the 1st century. The accounts of Christian martyrs during the 1st century are relatively limited in comparison to later periods. However, there is historical evidence indicating that persecution of Christians did occur during this time. Those specific records of martyrdom in the Colosseum for the 1st century might be less detailed or documented. Okay, I'm going to skip forward a bit. Quote some sources during the 1st century. ChatGPT. Specific references, sources dedicated to documenting Christian martyrdom during the 1st centuries are scanned. It says this again. The early Christian texts and writings that could mention persecutions come from the New Testament itself, particularly from the writings of the apostles and early Christian leaders. And I'm going to go bit further on there. So there are no sources of Christians being martyred during the 1st century. Apologies for any confusion, ChatGPT. While there are no direct detailed accounts of specific sources explicitly mentioning Christians being martyred in the Colosseum during the 1st century, there are indirect references and broader historical evidence suggesting persecution of Christians in the early years of the faith. So there are absolutely no extant historical sources for Christians being martyred in the Colosseum. One sec. In the Colosseum during the first century. ChatGPT. That's correct. There are no surviving extant historical sources or explicit documented accounts specifically detailing Christians being martyred in the Colosseum during the first century. The primary sources that mention Christian persecutions and martyrdoms in ancient Rome, including references to places like the Colosseum, come from later periods, notably from the 2nd century onwards. What about the second? Name them. It's the 2nd century. Yeah. Certainly. In the 2nd century, there are historical references and writings that document Christian persecutions and potential martyrdoms in the Colosseum. So the martyrdom of Ignatius, these are Christians, but these are Christian sources. The martyrdom of Ignatius of Antioch. Now, this is important. While the specific location of his martyrdom, this is 1:8 to 117 by the consensus dating. While the specific location of his martyrdom isn't explicitly mentioned, some traditions suggest he might have been taken to Rome and executed, potentially in a venue like the Colosseum. Martyrdom of Polycarp of Smyrna. While the execution location is not specified, it just repeats the same thing here. Some historical accounts mention amphitheaters as the site of his potential martyr. So some mention amphitheaters. It's not specific. The Acts of Justin Martyr, though the specific location of his martyrdom isn't specified, some traditions suggest it might have been put to death in the room. So, yes, at the end of it all, I ask, so there are no direct and verified accounts of any of the above being executed in the Colosseum. No direct and verified accounts of these martyrs being absolutely killed, murdered, brutalized in the Colosseum. That's correct, says Chat. It's a bit tortured, this, isn't it? I love Chat GPT, but sometimes it's a bit of a pain in the bum trying to get it to be direct at the beginning. There are traditions and suggestions within some historical accounts and early Christian writings that these figures might have been martyred in Rome and potentially in venues like the Colosseum. There are no direct, verified, or explicit accounts confirming their execution specifically at the Colosseum. The exact locations of their martyrdoms remain uncertain and are not definitively documented in historical records. Now, I was at the Colosseum only a few days ago, and my friend said to me, "Yeah, it's up on the wall. There were no martyrdom accounts actually having are extant of Christians dying in the Colosseum." And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." And I'd had a fairly good understanding of this before, and certainly knew very well that Christians, the notion of Christians or Jesus Christ, are not really extant during the 1st century. There is a tiny possibility that in the 90s there might have been mention of Christians. Some version of Acts might have mentioned Christians. Pliny the Younger is the first historian commentator to mention Christians. He was in command of an area where he has to. He was given the charge of torturing some Christians, and obviously by that time it's about 112, 114, say AD, the first mention of Christians in the historical record. Now, why is that? It's quite interesting, that, isn't it? It's a bit late. About 80 years late. But the interesting thing is, of course, and I'm going to go into this in another video soon, that there are no extant contemporary records of Christians or Christianity in the 1st century whatsoever, if we remove Josephus's claim that is most likely to be completely forged. So just wanted to make that clear. There's a book called The Myth of Persecution, well worth picking up. I have a copy. I'm about halfway through. I had to put it down a few months ago, unfortunately, but there you will find a very decent primary source litany litany of accounts that show you the limited persecutions of Christians at certain points in history. I'm going to leave that there, but it's not a widespread persecution. Ciao for now. Bye bye.